Panama is well known for the canal that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Thousands of embarkations cross from one to the other each year, generating revenues that represent a significant proportion of the GDP. After being part of the Spanish colonial empire, Panama became independent from Colombia in 1903. Almost immediately, the United States started the construction of the canal and the occupation of the lands surrounding it, controlling the area until 1979, when the agreement Torrijos-Carter entered into force. In the 70s and 80s, Panama was ruled by the military. In 1989, under the Ronald Reagan administration, the US invaded the country. A year later, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution condemning the intervention. Shortly after, the country's regime transitioned to democracy. With nearly 4 million inhabitants, the country has a high-income economy. However, inequality, poverty, and a weak development of public services negatively affect the living conditions of many Panamanians. In October 2023, an agreement with a mining company was rejected by a series of protests that ended with the cancellation of the contract signed. The main focus of these protests were environmental concerns, and the youth the main actors. On May 5th, the country will go to the polls. With these precedents in mind, in this first episode of Who is Voting 2024, we are asking, are the youth revitalizing democracy in Panama? To know more about the meaning and prospect of this election in Panama, we have Sabrina Bacal and Harry Brown Araúz. Sabrina has a long experience as a journalist working in the press, radio, and TV, and Harry is a researcher at the Center for International Political and Social Studies, CIEP in Spanish. By the way, a partner of the Albert Hirschman Center in the production of the podcast El Puente. Welcome, Sabrina and Harry.
Thank you for having me, Yanina.
Thank you.
Harry, how and to what extent the protest against mining launched in October 2023 have influenced the electoral campaign, for instance, redefining the central topics in discussion?
Okay, Yanina, thank you again for having me, for this invitation to this first episode of the Who's Voting series. It's a pleasure to be able to talk with you and with Sabrina about the upcoming Panamanian elections. But before answering that question, I think it's important to mention where we are in terms of elections and how events and issues that make this election especially important for Panama have been accumulating. These are the 7th elections since the transition to democracy in 1990, and the Panamanian party system has been reshaping itself. We started with a system of 2 major historical coalitions led by the Democratic Revolutionary Party and the Panamenista Party, to having 3 major parties, including then Ricardo Martinelli's Democratic Change Party. And later, in 2019, we have the successful emergence of non-partisan candidates. That's why some of us, maybe Sabrina too, suspected that the 2024 elections would come with significant changes. Add to that these are the first elections held in the country after the COVID-19 pandemic, and in other countries, we all know this has brought about significant changes. Also, we must consider that, as you mentioned, there were anti-mining mobilizations in 2023 that had a precedent in other protests in 2022. In surveys conducted by CIEPS, we have been asking about the country's main problems, and essentially, citizens are concerned about 4 or 5 issues: insecurity, corruption, unemployment, and education. Since 2021, the main problem has been corruption, with almost 30% of mentions. All of this is reflected in problems such as the collapse of the retirement program, the increase of informal work, or the poor provision of public services. What's interesting is that all these deficits were articulated by Panamanian people protesting in the streets with an anti-mining demand with a strong environmental frame. But the electoral offer was chosen months before the protest. In general, the candidates are not responding to those demands. They are continuing to do politics as usual. Presidential candidates have not reframed their proposals in order to relaunch the Panamanian economy in environmental terms. And there is a strong suspicion that some of them, if they win the election, may want to renegotiate the mining contracts. Yanina.
Thanks for this very useful brief picture of the political party systems and the current changes the system is facing. Sabrina, now I have a question for you. Do you consider the youth as a prominent or at least emerging political actor? Is there a connection between contentious politics, protest, and formal politics, the election? And even more, are youth protests the sign that environmental preoccupation are becoming more central, or this is only a concern of the youth?
Hi, thank you for the invitation and this important question. I think Panamanian youth is an important emerging political actor. 48% of the electorate is 40 years or younger. However, young people have tended to vote less than the rest of the electorate. In last elections, 32 of young eligible voters did not vote. Millennials and Gen Z were the protagonists of the protest against the mining contract at the end of last year. The question is if this will show the same impetus at the voting booth and how they will do so. There are independent or libre postulación coalitions like Vamos, which is led by Juan Diego Vázquez and Gabriel Silva, two young independent members of the National Assembly. The candidates running on that ticket are mostly young. They have yet to prove that a significant number of their candidates will be elected, as they will confront a system dominated by political parties. The presidential candidates are trying different strategies to win over this segment of the electorate. Judging by the polls, it is not clear whether the impact of the young vote will be dispersed between many candidates or a more unified bloc. It is also not clear either whether topics that are important to young people, like human rights and their environmental issues, will be decisive in the general election.
Yeah, this is an impressive data. 48% of the electorate is 40 years old or younger, and abstention, of course, is higher in this sector. You already spoke about free postulation. I would like to expand on that. Harry, do you think the free postulation of candidacies that allows individuals with a number of signatures in support to run for offices without having a party does increase youth participation or engagement in formal politics?
Indeed, Yanina. The topic of free postulation is very important in Panamanian politics today. The democratization of the Panama party system has become stagnant after the introduction of primaries and public financing in 1998. And our electoral system is extremely majoritarian, and it takes a lot of money to be a candidate with a chance of winning the election, which prevents new actors from entering and renewing politics. In that sense, non-partisan candidacy or free postulation candidates has been the way Panamanian society has found to introduce new actors into the electoral competition, colloquially called independents or independientes in Spanish. However, this has created some problems. The most important may be the difficulty in making this process permanent, a greater personalization of politics, and a greater difficulties in accountability. We could say that without non-partisan candidacy, there may there may have been greater abstention in 2019 because political parties are very unpopular in Panama. And in the last elections, the ones who abstained the most were the young people. In fact, in the legislative elections, there are a good number of young people taking advantage of non-partisan candidacies, as Sabrina said. I would say that the independents are a rising political actor in Panama, and so much so that some important members of political parties have preferred to run as non-partisan candidates. That is the case with presidential candidates Zulay Rodriguez and Melitón Arrocha. This also tells us that this legal frame needs to be rethought.
So Harry already mentioned the concern the Panamanians has around corruption, and this leads us to talk about former President Martinelli, who was the first in the polls until the court invalidated his candidacy. Sabrina, how do you understand that Panamanians are more sensitive to results, roba pero hace, he steals but he does, than to the rule of law? Or the support comes from the clientelistic network developed by his party?
Wow, this is the main question, I think, in this moment. After Martinelli's candidacy was invalidated, his party's candidate for vice president, José Raúl Mulino, leads the polls, despite not having the charisma of the former president. Martinelli's phenomenon is similar to Trump's. His victimization strategy is such that judicial accusations and sentences only strengthen him. With a very clever campaign, he seems to have transferred that popular support to Mulino. Martinelli es Mulino, Mulino es Martinelli, says the slogan. It can be seen as a triumph of robó pero hizo, but I think it goes beyond that. Despite his record in government, Martinelli has managed to sell himself, and I say himself because Mulino is running as a proxy, as an anti-establishment option. If you add to that the promise of putting money, chen chen in Panamanian slogan, into Panamanian pockets, you have a very attractive narrative. It's not entirely true as a narrative if it has proven successful. Ironically, Rómulo Rux, who took control of Martinelli's former party, is also trying to use Martinelli's image.
Panama does not have a second round, which means that information is key to making a decision that will be definitive in selecting the president. How do you assess the quality of the information available? Harry?
Yes, Yanina. It is true that Panama is one of the few cases in Latin America where there is no ballotage. So far, I don't believe that not having ballotage has been so critical. But if in this election the presidential winner does so with less than 30% of the votes, I think it would be worth discussing it. It would require a constitutional reform. It puts more pressure on the electorate. They only have one opportunity to select. I understand information in a way that goes beyond the electoral campaign and the media, Yanina. I believe that party identities provides the main information to the electorate. 30 years ago, people oriented their votes in a more predictable way because they knew what each party and its leaders stood for. The dismantling of the party system and the emergence of free postulation candidacies have made the voting decision very difficult, even though presidential candidates are well-known individuals. The citizens don't know who to vote for. I have a bold statement that I will share here for the first time, Yanina and Sabrina. Although they legally still exist, the fact that party members can support free postulation candidacies, that party members can run for parties different than their own parties, and more issues like that, lead me to say that sociologically our parties no longer exist. They are almost imaginary. there is no information that can overcome that problem. I think so.
Sabrina, as a prestigious and well-known journalist, you know well the public sphere in the country. How do you evaluate the formal debates, the ones organized by the tribunal, and the general conversation ongoing in the media and the digital sphere? Is Panama a polarized country?
The impact of the formal debates has been positive but limited. They have provided elements of contrast between the candidates' proposals and styles, but they are not that relevant, especially when the candidate leading the polls, Mulino, has decided not to attend. Traditional media has explored the country's main problems and challenges. To understand them correctly, citizens must know what's behind the editorial lines, especially in some newspapers. Ricardo Martinelli still manages a few. The digital world is something else. The positive side is that it has given an important vehicle for independent candidates to get their proposals to the population. In some ways, it has democratized the public debate. The negative side, it has also polarized our debates due to the very nature of social media. The arrival of artificial intelligence has magnified that damage.
And beyond the assessment of the quality of and access to information, how do you evaluate the process and the functioning of the political system? And more concretely, many analysts have suggested that there is an abuse of public resources by people seeking re-election, for instance at the legislative, which is negatively complemented by the weaknesses of the institutions of control.
Look, there are two setbacks to democracy that I would like to highlight. One is happening during the process, and the other is a potential outcome. Currently, there is a notable lack of equity in the electoral competition because officials, like you said, seeking re-elections, mayors, parliamentaries, use the state's resources and payroll for their electoral objectives, and the institutions that should prevent this from happening do not intervene. There are those who describe this as a low-intensity electoral fraud. Also, there are questions around a potential victory for José Raúl Mulino. He has promised to pardon Martinelli for his money laundering conviction. Mulino describes this and other trials as politically motivated. If this pardon were to happen, the role of justice and the separation of powers, which are vital in a democracy, would be weakened.
Harry, you have recently co-edited a book called El Populismo en América Central with María Esperanza Casullo, in which you show how, in the case of Panama, in the past, the presence of the US configured the reaction against an external enemy, quite typical in many populist discourses. What happens today in the campaign? Is the populist appeal in Panama as observed in neighborhood countries?
Yes, Yanina, as you said, we have just published a book on populism in Central America that I coordinated with our colleague María Esperanza Casullo. And in the chapter on Panama, which I wrote with political scientist Claire Nevache, we argue that historically Panamenians learned to be very populist people in order to get rid of the Americans' Canal zone. Even though currently we don't have a Canal zone, we still have a friend-enemy logic in our politics. And according to the regional survey we conducted for this research, in Panama, the new enemy for populist leadership are the politicians and the public servants. Of course, in Panama, we have a problem with the bottles, las botellas, that we need to break away. The bottles are the public employees who don't work. But in this election, we can say that any candidate who focus heavily on blaming politicians and public servants for the country's problems may be is using a populist logic in this election.
Do you have anything to follow up, Sabrina?
I agree with Harry, but I also see the proliferation of speeches and references very close to populism in several candidates. For example, Martinelli's Mulino promise of money in your pocket. Also, Zulai's statement that immigrants take jobs away from Panamenians. Ricardo Lombana has turned to Nayib Bukele, even though El Salvador circumstances do not fit the reality of Panama. These are only a few examples. If one makes a careful review of the viability of most of the electoral promises, one may arrive at the conclusion that the goal is to achieve power as an end in itself and not as a means for the betterment of the country.
Many analysts have seen the emergence of the protests in 2023 and the answers of the political system as a window of opportunity to increase the politicization of issues and the responsiveness of the political system. How do you evaluate this moment? Is it an opportunity to reinforce democracy, or the country faces a difficult time with the risk of backsliding? Sabrina already identified two aspects in which this risk is present. Harry, how do you see the issue?
Yanina, I love this question at the end of this conversation because it gives me the opportunity to outline the future options for Panama broadly. The protests in 2023 were, in their first part, a great exercise of citizen participation that defined from the streets what the country's project should be for the coming decades. As mentioned here, it was an awakening. Some people talk about a crisis. I think it was an awakening of the citizens. If your political and if our political and economic leaders understand, and the most important, obey that mandate, our democracy can be strengthened. If they don't, the possibility of regression is real. This should not only concern Panamanians for the obvious reasons, but should also matter to the world, or at least to Latin America. Panama, and this is because Panama is one of the two countries with the highest per capita income in Latin America, has had one of the most dynamic economies in the region, and our democracy has been, even with its problems, one of the strongest in the region. Panama is supposedly an exceptional case of success, as political scientist James Loxton has said. So, if Panama falls, also a model of progress for Latin America also fails.
So we are arriving to the end of this first episode of Who is Voting 2024, devoted to Panama. In many sense, Panama is an original country which faces many changes in recent times. In others, it's not so original. We knew today about the unpopularity of political parties and the concern of the population on environmental issues and corruption, for instance. And then the protest opened up an opportunity for revitalizing democracy. We will see in the future, we will see what happens also in this election on May 5th. Thank you, Sabrina and Harry, for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Yanina.
Thank you for the opportunity.